Today's lection devoted to subject, tasks, and methods of the investigation of human psychological condition. This is the first lection for medical psychology as a subject. Psychology is a science about the origin, development, and regular manifestation of psych activity of a human being. This term was formed from the Greek words psyche, soul, and logos, science. The main stages in development of psychology were: psychology as a science about human soul appeared in a field of philosophy more than 2000 years ago. In 17th century, due to the accelerated development of natural sciences, psychology appears as a science about consciousness which supposed to control the thought, wills, and emotions. In 17th of 19th century, psychology develops as an independent science. Its task was an observation of human behavior, deeds, and reaction without taking into account the motives and subjective factors. Also, the experimental branch of psychology began to develop. And modern psychology. The study of behavior has come a long way to be what it's today. Before the development of experimental psychology in the 19th century, the study of the mind was mostly related to philosophy. Therefore, we often come across the ideas of many philosophers when examining the history of psychology. Socrates, Aristotle, and other names are still studied today because they helped shape our view of the world and of ourselves. Cultures like Egypt, Greece, and Rome were sophisticated civilization, and while some of their ideas and practices might seem strange today, many of their notions are the early basis of many areas of knowledge, including science and psychology. Around 1500 before Christ, the Ebers Papyrus is one of the oldest documents containing medical knowledge. It contains the first known mention of psychological conditions like dementia and depression. In ancient Greece, Socrates believed that trust lies in every person's mind and can be defined by any authority. He considered knowledge to be beliefs backed by some rational explanation and was the first to use the word psyche as the seat of intelligence and character, formed by reason, will, and desire. Socrates also suggested that the best way to know the interior world was by asking oneself questions and through consciousness reflection. This is the basis of introspection. Hippocrates is often regarded as the father of medicine. He conceived the Hippocratic Oath, a pledge of ethics still taken today by new physicians. He also denied that demons were behind the development of disease. Hippocrates described several behavioral disorders and developed the theory of the four humors associated with temperament and personality. There were phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and bile. Plato considered that deductive reasoning is the strongest source of knowledge, the direct experience, and that all knowledge is innate. Thus, it can be acquired by introspection. He proposed that the human soul is divided into three different parts: rational, emotional, and appetitive. The work of Aristotle has influenced many areas of knowledge throughout history. He covered everything from biology to politics and psychology. There was no formal discipline called psychology in the Middle Age, but a number of medieval writers, particularly those from the 13th century, discussed concepts similar to those of present-day psychologists. More important, at least a fear. For example, Avicenna and Albertus Magnus seem to have been genuinely interested in psychological theory. Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, for the first time, rejected speculative conclusions about the nature of the soul and came to the conclusion that empirical research was necessary. Bacon separated the science of the body from the science of the soul, and in the doctrine of the soul he singled out the science of the rational divine soul and the irrational feeling or bodily soul, common to humans and animals. The most important new components about the soul introduced by Bacon are the idea of the role of society and tools in the process of cognition. A new period in the development of psychological knowledge began with the teaching of René Descartes, in which the term consciousness was first used. Consciousness was seen as a criterion dividing body and soul. Introspection was called the criterion of existence. According to the criterion of introspection, only man has a soul, and animals don't have a soul and act like mechanical devices. To explain the actual bodily actions in animals and humans, Descartes introduced the concept of a reflex, in which the principle of mechanistic determinism was realized. The essence of the reflex, according to Descartes, is that external influences through the movement of animal spirits along the nerves lead to tension in certain muscles, which is the action of the body. According to Descartes, the soul sets the body in motion, and the body delivers sensory impression to the soul. Wilhelm Wundt is often referred to as one of the fathers of modern psychology. Several of his works, such as Principles of Physiological Psychology, are classic and fundamental works in the field of psychology. Wundt tried to understand the human mind by studying the constituent parts of human consciousness. Just as when studying a complex chemical, it's broken down into its constituent elements. Thus, Wundt presented psychology as a science similar to physics and chemistry, in which consciousness is a collection of separable and identifiable parts. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is best known as a founder of psychoanalysis, which had a significant impact on psychology, medicine, sociology, anthropology, literature, and art of the 20th century. Freud's view on human nature were innovative for his time, and throughout the life of the psychologist didn't stop causing resonance and criticism in the scientific community. Interest in the scientist's theories doesn't fade to this day. Among Freud's achievements, the most important are the development of a three-component structural model of the psyche, the allocation of specific phases of psychosexual personality development, the creation of the theory of the Oedipus complex, the detection of protective mechanisms functioning in the psyche, the psychologization of the concept of the unconscious, the discovery of transference and countertransference, and the development of therapeutic techniques such as free association and dream interpretation. What is the main task of psychology? The principal tasks of psychology are: first one, study of the regulations of the psychic development of a human and its development. Second one, investigation of the reflection of reality in the mind of a human being. Third one, study of mechanisms, regulation, the action and activity of a human being. Next one, study of the mechanisms, creation, the psychic traits of a person. And final, determination of a certain dependence of psychic phenomena depending on the way of life and activity of the individual. Nowadays, psychology is a complex system of independent psychological science. The principal branches of psychology are general psychology, the study of common regularities in the psychic activity of a grown-up; child psychology, the study of regularities of the psychic development of a child; teenage psychology, the study of regularities of the psychic activity of teenagers; late age psychology, the study of regularities of psychic activity of elderly people; social psychology, the study of psychic phenomena in groups and collectives; pedagogical psychology, the study of the psychological basis of teaching and upbringing; work psychology, the study of the psychological basis of a man's working activity; pathopsychology, the study of various forms of disorders of psychic activity and their development; and other branches: medical, military, artistic, space, etc. Separation of medical psychology and an attempt to determine its importance as a subject of teaching goes back to 1852 with the publication of Medical Psychology, a work by Lotz, a German scientist. Medical psychology is a branch of psychology which studies the psychology of the patient, the role of psychic factors in the origin and development of the disease, the psychology of relationship between doctor, staff and patient, as well as the use of psychological approach in medical practice. Medical psychology has two lines of development: general medical psychology and applied medical psychology. General medical psychology studies psychological peculiarities of the patient, the criteria of normal, temporarily altered and morbid psyches, the correlation between an individual and a disease, psychology of a doctor in his relation with the hospital staff, psychology of relationship between the doctor, his patient and relatives, teaching on the doctor's duty and ethics, teaching on iatrogeny caused by the carelessness of a doctor's words, peculiarities of aging and its influence on the disease. Applied medical psychology studies psychology of patients suffering from neuropsychotic disorders, psychology of psychiatric patients and patients with dependencies, psychology of patients with neuro diseases, psychology of patients prior to and after a surgical operation, psychology of patients with cardiovascular, gastric, infectious, pulmonary, gynecological diseases, psychohygiene and psychoprophylaxis in cases of pregnancy and childbirth, psychology of endocrinological and oncological patients, psychology of patients with physical abnormalities and sensory defects, psychology of the disabled. For the scientific cognition of different mental phenomena and their functional mechanisms, medical psychology uses such methods. First one, method of observation. Second one, method of clinical interview. Third one, experiment. And final, psychodiagnostic examination. One of the most typical ways of examination is observation of an object, a person, a group of people, pending the phenomena interested by an examiner will show themselves to be recorded and described. By means of this method, the mental process, states and properties of sick and healthy are studied. Mentality is studied under natural living conditions, and this study differs from an experiment because a doctor or a psychologist is a passive observer that has to wait for those phenomena he is interested in. The advantage of this method is that during the observation, the natural cause of mental phenomena isn't broken. The disadvantage of the observation is that it doesn't allow determining the cause of a certain mental phenomenon precisely, because it's not possible to take into account all interrelation of a mental phenomenon in the process of observation. Observation is carried out under usual living conditions, in families, at work, game, during studies, in the hospital ward. The interview reveals the association interesting to the examiner on the basis of the empiric data which were received during real two-side contact with the patient. This method is needed for receiving information about the individual psychological peculiarities of the personality, psychological phenomena and psychopathological symptoms, inner picture of the disease, and the structure of the patient problem. It's also the way of psychological influence of the person, which is worked out directly on the basis of a personal contact between the doctor, the psychologist, and the patient. The principles of clinical interview are unambiguousness, exactness and simplicity of formulation, adequacy, sequence, flexibility and impartiality of interrogation, verify of the information received. The success of the interview depends on the examiner qualification that presuppose the capability to establish the contact with an examined person, to give him an opportunity to express himself as freely as an experiment. An experiment differs from observation because it presupposes the arrangement of a clinical situation which allows carrying out a relatively absolute control of variables, which is impossible at observation. A variable is reality that can be changed in an experimental situation. One of the most important advantages of an experimenter over an observer is manipulation of variables. An observer is interested in any interrelation of phenomena, but in an experiment under certain condition, it's possible to introduce a new element and to determine whether this or the change in the situation takes place. An examiner expects the situation as a consequence of the change made by him, but an observer has to wait for the change which may not take place. An experiment can be divided into 4 types: laboratory, natural, establishing, and forming. On the basis of psychodiagnostic examination, the hypotheses about the dependencies between different psychological descriptions are checked. When their peculiarities are revealed in the sufficient number of the examined, it's possible to determine their interrelation on this basis of the proper mathematical procedures. The main methods of psychodiagnosis are testing and interviewing. Their systematic expression in tests and questionnaires, which are also called methods. The methods make it possible to collect the diagnostic information in the relatively short time. They give the general information about the person, about this or those of his peculiarities in particular, an intellect, anxiety, etc. And they allow the making and quantitative and qualitative comparison of an individual with other people. A test is try out a task or a task system which help to estimate the mental state of maturity of examined. Psychodiagnosis uses a number of experimental psychological methods of test which help to estimate the functioning of both separate areas of mental activity and integrative formation, such as temperament types, personality peculiarities, and personal traits. There are verbal, or language, and non-verbal picture tests. 2 groups of tests, standard and project, are usually distinguished. The test directed toward estimation is called a standard test. However, there are tests that are directed not toward the estimation indices, but toward the qualitative personality peculiarities. Project methods belong to this group of tests. They are based on the fact that the personality is realized through various manifestations of an individual, including some hidden unconscious needs, conflicts, feelings. Questionnaires. Questionnaires are the methods containing a number of questions to be answered by the examined person in order to find out whether he agrees with them or not. There are questionnaires of an open type. Answers are given arbitrarily, and of a closed type. Answers are chosen from the variants given in the questionnaire. Personality questionnaires used for evaluation of personality characteristics are divided into several groups. A. Typological questionnaires, worked out on the basis of personality type determination, allow referring the examined to this or that type which differs its peculiar manifestation. B. Personality traits questionnaires, which determine the expression of traits, style personality signs. C. Motives questionnaires. D. Importance questionnaires. E. Aims questionnaires. F. Interest questionnaires. The different methods of psychological examination can be used in combination, thus creating a full picture of a person's mental condition. The last stage of experimental psychological examination necessarily contains a written conclusion based on the received data. Thank you for your attention.